Well, welcome to another episode of the Scriptural Mormonism podcast. I'm your host, Robert Bodden. As you can probably tell because of the different background, I finally made it to the States. So thanks to everyone for the prayers, well wishes, crossed fingers. I fought the feds and the IRS, and we eventually won. So I'll be here until at least August of 2025. So looking forward to that, and also participating on the Interpreter radio show in the new year, where we will be discussing the New Testament. And hopefully I'll be called as Gospel Doctrine Teacher for my SA award soon. So that'll be fun as well. So and hopefully, and because there won't be any major time zone differences between myself and the guests now, we're going to be a bit more regular in our scheduling of things. So with that, hopefully we'll have Nathaniel Givens on to discuss part 2 of the abortion episode. And also we'll have him and maybe Terrell on to discuss their most recent book as well. So be on the outlook for that and other fun episodes coming up. There'll be something in the pipeline about the late John Trenton as well, which I hope we'll announce in the near future if some things happen. So fingers crossed for that as well. So with that being said, today we actually have a guest. Many of you know him. He's published in many venues, Fair Interpreter, The Farm's Review, and so forth. It's Kevin Christensen. Kevin, thanks for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Today we'll be discussing your article Truth and Method, which is a critique of the methodology of Dan Vogel. But before we kind of discuss that interesting article, and I'll link to it in the show notes, of course, as well as your interpreter page where many of your articles appear. Maybe if we were to just briefly discuss who you are, what's your background? Have you always been a member of the church? What got you interested in delving deep into say Latter-day Saint scripture and related topics? And just tell us a bit about yourself.
Okay. Well, I grew up in Utah, basically a baby boomer family, kind of. We had 5 boys, 1 girl, extended family throughout Utah. So we got to see a lot of the state, go to church in lots of different parts of the state and things, and just grew up happy Mormon, watching, older kid after older kid going off on missions and coming back changed. And so that was always something to see. So I went on a mission in 73. We went to England to the Leeds mission and enjoyed my time there. And it was there a member of the church loaned me a copy of Hugh Nibley's An Approach to the Book of Mormon. And I took it to the bathtub on a P-Day. Thought I'd read the interesting chapters, and I read the whole book. And that one, not in order. I just went back and forth until I'd done the whole thing. So, and so that was a mind-blowing experience for me. So when I got back from my mission, I wanted to get me some more of that. So I tracked down all of the stuff that was there. And back then, this was, we didn't have the internet. We didn't have, all sorts. We didn't have farms at that point. So it was looking in used bookstores and bound periodicals. And in my own house, there was actually a kind of a cache that was enlightening to me. We had back issues of the Ensign. And so I was looking for more Nibley, and so I found the Enoch series, and I looked beyond that, found the Pearl of Great Price series, found everything else, and then periodically Nibley would refer to something that was interesting, or else in the same issue of the Improvement Era, there'd be some articles by Richard L. Anderson on the witnesses, and I ran across those and read those, and that led to other things. So it was just things leading to other things. Sunstone, when I got back from my mission, my older brother had subscribed to Sunstone, so I started reading that, and eventually, very eventually, I realized on occasion I had something to say. And there was the first one I wrote was for dialogue. There was an article by Anthony Hutchinson on the creation stories, and that one gave me trouble for a couple of days. And he had a diagram of the Hebrew cosmos in there, and I was looking at the diagram and kind of pondering its implications. And I thought, where have I seen something like that? And I realized, well, because I'd read lots of Nibley, and one of the books Nibley referred to as Hamlet's Mill, so I got Hamlet's Mill and read that. And I saw a connection between some passages in Hamlet's Mill and this diagram of the Hebrew cosmos, and that triggered me writing an essay that I sent to Dialogue. And actually, they had it for so long that I'd forgotten that I'd written it. And they sent it back, and we did some editing, and it was eventually published. But the first thing that was published that I did was a review of a book by Dan Vogel called Indian Origins in the Book of Mormon. So this is in around 1985 or so. There was the big noise was the publication of the Roberts studies. And of course, this was the studies comparing View of the Hebrews to the Book of Mormon, and Roberts making a case. And this is, kind of a big deal at the time. And Jack Welch wrote a really good response to that I still think is amazing. And, I decided to read Indian Origins in the Book of Mormon, not knowing anything about Dan Vogel or what his perspective would be. I just thought, well, let's bring it up today, because I'd read Silverberg's book on the Mound Builders. I thought, here's a more recent book, I'll read that. And when I read it, I realized that because of what I read, I had something to say. And that included Kuhn and Eliade and various other things that I made connections. So I sent that off, wrote it on my Atari ST, and printed it out. And sent it off to Maxwell Institute as published. And then I later said some other things. Did one on nigh to death, near-death experience research in the Book of Mormon. We did one on Nephite feminism in the Book of Mormon. We'd read Carol Lynn Pearson's article, and I read it in Sunstone, and without saying anything, I handed it to my wife, and I said, "What do you think?" And then we talked about that, and I eventually wrote that up, and that was an article. And at one point, Ed Farms was having a tour of Dead Sea Scrolls artifacts that went through Topeka, Kansas, and we lived in Lawrence, so we went out there to be the ushers for that. And while we were ushering, my wife took a break and went in the break room, and she talked to Kevin Barney and said, "Yeah, my husband's Kevin Christensen. He's written some stuff for Farms." And Kevin Barney apparently said, "Oh, the famous Kevin Christensen." Before that, I had no idea. And I didn't realize until a bit later that most of the stuff that's published in the review and Journal of Book of Mormon Studies is solicited. And all of my stuff I just sent in, and it all got through. And so I had no idea that I was doing anything unusual. And then of course, I wrote Paradigms Regained about Margaret Barker's work, and that by far has gotten the most notice. Most of the time when you publish, at least when I published, it's like what Robert Heinlein said. He's the science fiction author, Robert Heinlein. He said, publishing is like dropping feathers down a well. And it's gratifying to see the thing in print. That I very, very rarely meet anyone who has read any of my stuff, unless I physically handed it to them and said, "Here, read this, and what do you think?" But most of the time it's just, this is my bookshelf, and most of the people in my ward have no idea.
Well, thanks for the background. And I'm kind of glad you kind of mentioned Barker, because I know you've done a lot of other great stuff, but I think that is the thing you're best known for. I think you're sometimes known as the Barker guy. And you have a most recent article in Interpreter on revisiting Paradigms Revealed. Part 1 was published a few weeks ago, and I'm sure Part 2 will be published soon as well.
Yeah, so. Part 2 will be published at the end of January. That's the defense of Margaret Barker. She's read both parts. And she told Jeff Lindsay, who's the editor now, he said she told him that it was perfect. So that helped me get some of the stuff in it that I wanted to make sure stayed.
Well, I look forward to reading the Defense of Barker. I've read all her books, and there are some things where I think she's great, like temple theology. Some areas where I would completely disagree with her, like on Mariology, but I do look forward to looking at your defense of her, so that'll be fun. And just on the B.H. Roberts, I just thought I'd a bit tangential, but because you mentioned the study from 85 by on the Mormon or aka B.H. Roberts Foundation website, we do have a Q&A on B.H. Roberts, as well as research materials, so you can look at the primary and secondary sources for yourself as well. So just thought I'd plug that, because if LDS did patron saints, Roberts would be mine. So but today we're going to be discussing your article, and as I said, I'll link to it in the show notes. Truth and Method: Reflections on Dan Vogel's Approach to the Book of Mormon. So you've kind of briefly mentioned Dan Vogel, but for the audience who may not be familiar with who Dan Vogel is, who is Dan Vogel, and what has he published, and maybe if you were to tell some of your prior interactions with him before writing this article.
Okay, well, Vogel after his mission, I guess he lost his faith in the church and started doing things. I think the first book of his that I noticed was Indian Origins in the Book of Mormon, which it's useful. It's got lots of good information on it, kind of going through the kinds of ideas about how did the Indians get here. the indigenous populations in America. And there's all sorts of theories that are being tossed around. And so the premise of his book is that you can take imagination plus environment. There's the Book of Mormon, and that's the case that he's making. Then, so I wrote my review of it. It was published in the second edition of the review of books on the Book of Mormon, and then later he wrote a criticism of that and published it online. Then I wrote Truth and Method, and so we've kind of gone back and forth over the years. I met him once or twice, and we've occasionally crossed swords on some of the boards. And so he published a book called about the seeker movement and tried to connect that
religious seekers and
religious seekers and the advent of Mormonism. Yeah, and he's done a huge biography of Joseph Smith from his framework, the making of the prophet, that came out some years ago, and he's got another one apparently that's going up to 1839 that's coming out. And he's also published at least 5 volumes of collections of early Mormon documents from the church. And like Larry Morris, in his review of one of Vogel's books, very highly praised the collections that he put out, just for all of this stuff right there. And so that's important that he's got this 5 volumes of early Mormon documents. So he knows the historical documents, but we have different frameworks for looking at it, and that's the thing.
And that comes in. But just like a word about Vogel myself, like he's 5-volume series, which is actually now on archive.org on the signature books section. It's an excellent series. Like, I disagree with Vogel when it comes to biblical and scriptural interpretation. I think he's pretty lousy when it comes to theology. But when it comes to, say, collecting documents and just making it out there, that series is like phenomenal. So you have to give him props for that.
Yeah.
Even if you disagree with his interpretive notes on throughout. But this kind of goes into, like, say, the essay, like it kind of goes into the issue of methodology. I think it would be fair to say, although he might disagree with, like, he is a metaphysical naturalist, you're not, I'm not, and that kind of colors one's interpretation. So maybe if you were like taken from there, like why did he write the essay, and like maybe if you want to like discuss like some of the highlights,
Okay. Well, one of the things that I've done from the start, almost from the start of my writing, is that I made a connection between Alma 32 and this book. This is Thomas Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. It's, it came out, I've got the second edition enlarged from 1962, and it's a study of how the basic frameworks in which science has done changed. And one of the examples Kuhn uses is the shift from Ptolemaic astronomy to Copernicus, and how that happened. And he's pointing out, the book is called The Structure, so that in itself is important, that there is a structure for how that happens. But the important thing about it is that it's based on values rather than rules. And it has to be, because what is at stake is this set of rules that you use for evaluating a situation. And when a scientist, scholar, when any of us, we're to internalize a set of rules to the extent that we don't know we've got it, like we're like the fish that are the last to discover water, because we swim inside of it. But what happens with the scientific revolution is that we've been taught this is how the world works, and then we're looking, and the ancient astronomers are looking, what about these stars that start going backwards and that move a lot? Everything else seems pretty structured, but there's the planets, the wanderers. I think that's one of the meanings of the word for planet, is that they're wandering around and they're trying to account for the motion. And so Ptolemaic astronomy had gotten very complex, and it was getting kind of kludgy, especially in accounting for the retrograde motion. And they didn't have any set theory for doing that, except for, they call it epicycles, and they go backwards. But then Copernicus comes along and says, well, the whole thing is a lot simpler if you assume circular orbits. And so it's the simplicity of that became attractive, but it wasn't as accurate at first. And then later along, Kepler that comes along, and he says, well, he does the measurements, and he says elliptical orbits make it more accurate. So, but it's a process. It doesn't happen overnight. It can be generational. And it happens not when people immediately see the new theory and realize, well, I accept truth from whatever source. It's that they have to undergo what Kuhn calls a paradigm shift, to be able to see things in a different way. And he quite literally makes it a conversion experience. And So Kuhn talks about the important thing is you notice that something's wrong. So you need to loosen the rules and come up with another theory for explaining that is going to explain more than the last theory did. You know, like one of the things they talk about is that Einstein's theory was persuasive not only because it explained some things that Newton's couldn't, but also it explained why Newton's theory was as successful as it was. You know, so that these shifts happen, and it happens when somebody sets up a new example of work. Kuhn cites Franklin's electricity, and that was such an outstanding achievement at the time that it attracted everyone to that model. So people, come in like schools of fish, come into the model, they start working on it, they refine it, they get it better and better and better. Eventually, one of the things that happens is you start running into the anomalies, the questions. And this happens, of course, in religion. It's just, all of this concern about, I had a crisis of faith. This isn't what I expected. And one of the things that I've done is when I run across something that I didn't expect, I ask myself, oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that. I wonder what I can do to find more. And most importantly, what should I expect? And this is what Jesus calls, look at the beam in your own eye first. And I'm able to quote a great example of Bacon. And Bacon is the founder of science, the scientific method. But he fought Copernicus. He just said, just use your eyes and look. And if you just look, you cannot doubt that the sun moves and the earth is at rest. And he's not being unscientific. He's not being irrational. He's just using that framework. And for him, the little retrograde movements of the planets isn't the most important thing. The most important thing is that his way of thinking and way of looking tells him this has to be it, and he can't even question it. And so the people that were able to question it were able to imagine, well, what would it look like if I was on an Earth that was in motion around the sun? Instead of thinking, well, I can see that motion, but I couldn't, I don't see any of my motion. So it's this getting at the framework. And I realized myself that, starting on my mission and in conversations with people on personal experiences, people coming in and out of faith, it was that the decision, which problems are most important to have solved, and what's the framework? How do you decide what's significant, what's important? And so when I read Indian Origins, for example, one of the things I could clearly see was that there are specific statements in there that I can see where he's using a different framework than I am. And then because of Kuhn, you realize you have to be able to step back. There's a difference between saying, I disagree, you are not us. We are obviously right. You are wrong. That's not really an evaluation. It has to be comparative. You have to be able to say, look at this, and which is better? And then how do you mention better? Well, Kuhn says you have to have puzzle, definition, and solution, accuracy of key predictions, comprehensive,ness and coherence. And this just isn't within, like looking at a small problem. I explained the small problem, but it's how whole different fields relate. It's how does, for the Book of Mormon, there's lots of different approaches to it. There's the linguistics, there's the archaeology, there's the ethical part, there's the spiritual part. And how does all of that fit together? And how does it fit together with the Bible? And how does it fit together with cosmology? That's the big, broadest possible picture. How does that go down with the specific things that we can test? There's also the fruitfulness. You try it on for size, and you see, if you start seeing things that you never would have seen otherwise, that unexpected discovery, because you try on the new framework. And there's the simplicity and aesthetics. And that was important, say, for the Copernican revolution, because it wasn't as accurate at first, but it was so simple and had the potential to explain more. There's, Alma talks about it being delicious and enlightening the mind and enlarging the soul. And also, Kuhn finally points out that it's going to be a faith decision ultimately, because we don't know everything yet. Nobody does. So you're just making a decision: which framework should I use to go forward? And that in considering that we don't know everything, that always has to be a faith decision. So I see Kuhn and Alma 32 is offering the same epistemology. For me, it's a way to think: okay, I am having a paradigm debate with these people. Let's treat it like it is. Let's put our assumptions up front. I'm a believer, and Vogel is a skeptic. Okay, but that doesn't settle the question. But what can we do? We can say, well, which questions are most significant to solve? Which puzzles are set up that we can test? How big of a, how does it fit in with everything else we know? And nobody knows everything, so that's just going to be, our subjective things. And is it kludgy? Is it or is it does it rely on ad hoc things? Which is the epicycles in Ptolemaic astronomy were ad hoc. There was no real theoretical justification for them. It was just they had to have it there to account for planetary motion. It wasn't a general thing. And of course, sometimes they'll say what we're doing is ad hoc. So it was important in the essay to go through and describe what ad hoc is and say, are the things that we're doing, say, with looking at the Book of Mormon as a translation, are they based on general principles, or do we just invent them to solve problems in the Book of Mormon? And I can make the case, I think a really good case, that the LDS scholars have been drawing on their expertise and bringing general principles in to help us have a better explanation and understanding of the Book of Mormon. And one of the most important expectations is from Doctrine and Covenants, section 1, where it says that this is mine authority and the authority of my servants. In D&C. So the Lord is basically saying, what should you expect? What should I expect? Well, if they're a prophet, they should be right about everything. They should know everything. They should have truth up on the shelf. It's just right back there. I can get it. We've got it. There's nothing left to learn. We never have to repent. We're beyond repentance because we have, the big book of what to think. And if anything proves anything is wrong in that whole book, then the whole thing disagrees. Well, some people think like that, but I don't, because D&C 1 tells me specifically that the Lord has given these revelations to us in our weakness, according to the language, that they might come to understanding, and inasmuch as they erred, it might be made manifest. No big, and inasmuch they sought wisdom, they might be instructed. So it's describing humans in a process where they've got more to learn. That's us. We've got more to learn. We can be wrong about stuff. And the implications of being wrong, one of the stories I talk about was growing up in Utah. One of my very earliest memories when I was very young, 3 or 4 years old. My dad drove us to the Cleveland Lloyd dinosaur quarry in central Utah. So you could fairly call it a road. You couldn't tell that it was a road other than there might be some tire tracks here and there. So you're driving over the rocks in the dust and you get out there and there's no building yet. It's just this place where they're exposing bones in the rocks. So I'm a child. I haven't, this is before I could read any books, but I could look and I could see there were bones in the rocks. Now, a lot has changed about how the dinosaurs have been understood and put together and how they behaved and what they look like, and all sorts of things have changed. But the one thing that hasn't changed is that the bones are real, and that a child can know that the bones are real. And if I have that as my foundation for my faith, like I've experienced things that tell me, yeah, the bones are real, then I've got room to adjust how you put the bones together and how, what their environment was and how they behave. There is room for growth and change. If I have that central thing, yeah, the bones of this are real. I got my testimony, so I have room to understand, and I have room to appreciate that maybe Joseph Smith didn't know everything. Maybe when he was translating the book, he could be surprised by something. The famous story of, were there walls around Jerusalem? So they had to go get a Bible. Yeah, see, okay, let's go back to translating. There has to be room for us to be able to grow instead of thinking any change is going to destroy the whole thing.
No, thanks for that. That's a very good background to say expectations and so forth.
Yeah.
And I think this kind of comes out to the fore, if you will, when it comes to say Vogel's insistence that not only the original readers of the Book of Mormon understood it in a mound builder's paradigm, if you will, but the text is about the mound builders, if you will.
Yes.
As opposed to the so-called ad hoc, and we'll discuss this, limited geography model that's accepted by most, not all, but most, I heard they say apologists and scholars these days. Out some form of John Sorensen model. So maybe if you were to maybe discuss this, Now, is it true, like, say, some or all the original authors and readers, I should say, in the 19th century understood some kind of mound builder paradigm to interpret it? And do you think that means that? Do you think that means that the text itself teaches it, or do you think that's what's called the intentionalist fallacy?
Yeah.
Take it from there.
Yeah. I think because the existence of the mound builder concept was there and it was fairly common, that was the waters in which they swam, and that's how they thought. So I think I made a case in my first review, Vogel, that like, say, the Wentworth letter that was originally actually drafted by Orson Pratt rather than Joseph Smith, and it's some of the ideas in there, I think you can clearly align with the mound builder theory, but there's a problem in matching it up to the actual text of the Book of Mormon. And this is this idea that they're coming to it new and fresh, and it takes time to absorb it. It's just, we don't start with calculus. I mean, that's where I ended. I had trouble with calculus. I could do math and geometry and geography, all of this going up to that point. But we have to start somewhere. Where we start out as a little child. We start out ignorant, and we have to just try and put it together in our mind. And we have to start with our own cultural background expectations. Like, for example, when I would read, going through the Book of Mormon the first times in junior high and high school, reading King Benjamin's discourse, I'd been to state conference. I'd been to general conference. I could imagine this like a conference talk. So then on my mission, when I sit down and read chapter 23, there's chapter 27, an approach to the Book of Mormon, and he says, no, this is an ancient coronation ceremony. And in an ancient coronation ceremony, there's these 36 things that happen in order, and here they are in Mosiah. That, for me, was a paradigm change. That takes me out of my culture. So what Nephi talks about, you can't understand the things of the Jews like unto them, save you are taught after the manner of the things of the Jews. This is why you've got your language skills and your theological skills, things that I can't do. I don't have them. I can kind of try and stand on the shoulders of people that do at times to see if I can see better what they see. But that's a limitation. If I go to the Book of Mormon expecting that I've got limitations and that the early readers have limitations, then I'm open to repent. I'm open to have my perspective changed. And so if I go and I read something like, okay, well, what is the geography of the Book of Mormon? And regardless of what they thought, you've got to start with what's in the text itself. It isn't that should I give priority to what, say, Parley P. Pratt or Joseph Smith or anyone else thought about the Book of Mormon, or should I do Mormon and Moroni and Nephi and their descriptions count? Who are the actual eyewitnesses? Well, let's go to the text. And you go to the text and you have things like the story of Limhi's explorers and Amos people, and you add up the journey. So they go from in the region of Nephi to Zarahemla, got 21 days on foot with a group of families and flocks. So they can't be traveling much more than 10 miles a day. 21 days, that's a limit. And so if you're trying to correlate that story and the story of Limhi's explorers with a hemispheric geography, it simply doesn't work. And from the perspective of like Vogel and Metcalf, they're saying, well, that shows that Joseph Smith didn't know what he was talking about. Or even Michael Coe, there's a thing that Michael Coe says that I still think it's pretty hilarious, that he says when Coe is a Mesoamericanist who'd read Brody in the 40s and read the Book of Mormon in the 40s, and then became a famous Mesoamericanist and was occasionally recruited starting in the 70s in dialogue and then later some other interviews to talk about the Book of Mormon. And he talks about when Joseph Smith in Nauvoo got the Stevens book on the ruins in Mesoamerica, he said Joseph Smith was flabbergasted when I hear these ruins in Mesoamerica, not where he thought they were when he wrote the Book of Mormon. But that's the problem is who's imagining here? Is it co-imagining what Joseph Smith was imagining and having him surprised, or else the Book of Mormon itself is describing something and we have to put it in that setting, and we have to start with things that help us get there. Like the early saints would tend to start with Narrow Neck Hill. We know there's a hill here. We have a story about the hill in the Book of Mormon. Where they read close, are they reading closely enough? Are they reading about Mormon and Moroni taking the plates out of the hill Cumorah and then wandering for 40 years. So it's the text of the Book of Mormon makes it pretty clear that even though there are records buried in their Cumorah, it's pretty clear that that's not the hill where it's not the same hill. And there are different associations that Sorensen looks at carefully, and others, Larry Paulson has done some really good stuff on that. But, you just look at the journeys, look at features like a narrow strip of land that extends from the East Sea to the West Sea. And if you're looking for a narrow strip of wilderness, a narrow strip of wilderness that extends from the East Sea to the West Sea. And in that narrow strip of wilderness, you have the source of the Sidon. And the Sidon starts flowing from the east to the west and then going north. It's going to go past Zarahemla land, probably enter into the Eastern Sea. And it's got to be south of a place where cities are built in cement. And you start putting these things in place. You've got specific distances you have to account for. You've got specific geographic features. You've got to account for things like, well, there's the rise and fall of civilizations at a particular time, and we know that they had written languages. Well, you start looking for those things. And if these are the things that you're testing for, and if these are the things that you're basing your model on, that moves most people to look at it down to Mesoamerica. So, that's where you've got Sorensen's Ancient American Setting for the Book of Mormon, and which came out, almost around the time the Vogel's book did. And so we've got these different models to compare. So how do you compare them? And that's why I like Kuhn so much, is he says this is what you should be looking for when you compare them. Testability, puzzle definition and testability, and accuracy of key predictions, comprehensiveness and coherence. That's why there's your model of what happened, of say the mound builders. If Joseph Smith is drawing on the mound builders myths, how does that explain the New World parts of the Book of Mormon? The approach that we take to the Book of Mormon has to explain both sides, what you've got in the New World and in the Old World, as well as, of course, the content. Does it have anything to say? Which is another approach that a lot of people are looking at now, treating it mostly as an ethical document or reading it as literature. All of this stuff has to ultimately fit together, and in the process of time, there are going to be puzzles that are unsolved, and that's all right too. Kuhn calls that the essential tension that we do our work in. We've got open questions. Well, that's, it's just as scholars, as readers, we want to solve the puzzle. And it's an awareness of the open questions shouldn't be a big deal. It's just, these are the open questions. And it's being aware of them instead of saying, well, that can't be right. The question is, well, how are we going to resolve this question? And over time, then one day, I'll reach down and go to a Dallas bookstore and look up on a shelf, and I see this. Oh, that looks interesting. What's that going to do if I read that? And then you get a new framework, a new paradigm, and it changes things. And then lots of more research and readers are attracted to that. And we find stuff that we never would have imagined otherwise. And that in and of itself excites us and moves us on.
Yeah, thanks for that. I was kind of going through your article, and something that I highlighted would be something that Vogel wrote. It would be pointless for me to refer to Joseph Smith if I did not also believe his views were consistent with the Book of Mormon. They were consistent because he wrote the book. And that kind of contrast, Ben McGuire and others have discussed what's called the intentionist fallacy. Just the interpretation a translator of a text heists onto a text does not mean that's the actual exegetical proper interpretation. Right. But of course, Vogel has the a priori assumption because of his metaphysical naturalism that Joseph was the ultimate author of the text, even if he pilfered from his environment. But you're going to show, the paradigm, he may have been just as misinformed, and as much of a student of the exegesis of the text as everyone else is, us included. That has to play a role in how we approach the text on an exegetical level ourselves. So that's
and we realize that we're looking at two different pictures, and we have to have a way of comparing that isn't strictly paradigm dependent. We can't get completely away from that because it was the famous quote in our Hansen, all data is theory laden. We just admit that up front. Yeah, this is my theory, and it's going to affect how I read. So I'm going to look at another one, and I have to take a comparative view. And when I make the comparison, I can't say us, not us. I have to say why us, which is self-reflective. Why us? And so when I'm, all of the stuff that I've done, I've tried to keep that there to make sure it's comparative, to make sure I put my own assumptions up front. And when I'm asking which is better, I'm using accuracy of key predictions. So I'm saying, well, these are why I think these are key. I can't say that the Book of Mormon has a hemispheric geography because Joseph Smith must have known, never mind what DNC1 says about the limitations on prophets, but must have because God touched it. Therefore, they must have known. They must have been like God's sock puppets and have no will of their own and instantly become omniscient, except for all of the evidence that they aren't. So it's looking at those details and saying who's really got the best handle on the details and what they mean. And that's why I loved the Old Farms Review, because we got so many brilliant people contributing. You mentioned Ben McGuire's stuff and Sorensen and Larry Colson and Jack Welch and yourself and you get people that have expertise that was not even imagined in Joseph Smith's time by anybody. And you get all of these people coming from different directions and bringing their expertise, looking at the Book of Mormon and finding things that are extraordinary. And then that's the fruitfulness part of Christensen. It's just because you try it on for size, you accept it. Let's just get inside and work with it. And we see things that we otherwise never would have imagined.
Now, before we're going to go a bit more and into a few other topics, one response that comes up from Metcalf and Vogel is, well, this is all ad hoc reasoning. So, and you do discuss why it's not ad hoc. You also discuss what is ad hoc. So, perhaps if you want, maybe if we discuss what is ad hoc reasoning, and he's say some of these so-called apologetic tropes, say the limited geography model and stuff like that. Are these really ad hoc, or is it actually based on? Because you've kind of shown, say, when it comes to, Liam Hayes' party, that kind of goes against the hemispheric model. And then you have to claim, well, Joseph was inconsistent, which, of course, he's special pleading Christensen. And it's well, he was a modalist, but whenever he refuted modalism, he was just being inconsistent and he didn't understand modalism. So if you went to, maybe just touch upon that, because you do actually have a section in the review on that.
Yeah, I'm trying to find the pages. But Kuhn points out that an ad hoc explanation is something, in his example, and it's one that I use in the essays, is ad hoc is something it's just to explain a specific circumstance but doesn't have general application. And a general principle is something that has broad application. And so it's the idea when you're translating across cultures, it's a general principle that things going from one culture, they aren't necessarily going to translate quite as easily as you'd like. And for me, just when I went to England, these are some of the examples that I gave. Some of the words that the English were using didn't have the same meaning that I was expecting. They didn't have elevators, they had lifts. They didn't have trucks, they had lorries. They didn't have cookies, they had biscuits. They didn't have French fries, they had chips. They didn't have cookies, but they had biscuits. So this idea that going across cultures, there are going to be changes in language. That's just a general principle, and language changes over time as well. It's not something that's consistent. It's like the words, the meaning behind the words does not emanate from the objects and the actions themselves, but are all cultural conveniences that we come up with and that we learn and we work with and that change, especially as different cultures interact. So there's a general principle behind it that I completely overlook. And actually what they're doing is that they're saying that we're doing, their way of dealing with our explanations is itself an ad hoc argument to try and get rid of the findings the things that we're coming up with. I was just browsing one of Larry Morris's things. He did, I think he's done some of the best refinements to Sorensen's model, especially with the issue of directions, where he made the case for the mesomark, and directions are based on where the sun rises, but since that changes over the season, then this becomes eastward. It's not a straight line. That's east. That always means it's this whole part of the quadrant. And then there's northward, and you get that language in the Book of Mormon. And then there's westward. That's where the sun sets. So it's enough of a change. And then when he overlays it on the maps and some of its works, you can see, yeah, this actually accounts for what we've got in the Book of Mormon, and it does so based on general principles about how these things, about things like directions and language. A lot of the words are cultural conventions, and it's I think when Jesus talks about removing the beam from your own eye first, that's part of this. Is part of the things that we get from literature and traveling into other countries is we start to realize that a lot of the stuff that we take for granted is a cultural thing. Like I had a friend who moved from Utah to Chicago when we were in junior high. He came back and he said, "Oh, what's it like, up there in Chicago, up in Naperville?" And he said, "I found that you could be friends with someone who wasn't your exact same age." And for us, since we were all in these little Utah wards, and we all had our primary classes together, we had our first grade and second grade. We were all kind of lined up in just these little age groups. And he says when he went out there, especially in the church, since they were spread out more, that thing that was a part of our culture, he immediately noticed as well, this is different. And it has to be, like when I went to England and saw certain things that were different. A lot was the same, but there's certain things that are just going to be different. And then my wife went to France and Switzerland. Things still different yet. When we read literature, part of the experience in reading science fiction, especially, go into another world, and then you come back, and then it helps you get some perspective on our own world, to be able to see things that otherwise you're just taking for granted. This is the way things are. It's a wake-up call that we all have beams in our eye all the time. And if we're open to that, looking at our own assumptions and realizing, I don't know everything. I'm not seeing things from every angle. And it should be, what Alma says, does this not enlighten your mind? Does this not enlarge your soul? It's that experience of change. And that's part of the pleasure of scholarship, is to have somebody come along and show you something that you didn't know was there. And it becomes such, I think for me, it's such a pleasant experience. It's enlightening. And the difference between enlightenment and disillusion is your attitude toward what happened. Whether you're thankful for it or you resent it. If you have a sense of entitlement, I should have known. How come people didn't tell me that? How come nobody told me this? And there's this bitter frustration that a lot of people who are critical of the church express and feed on. That's very Trumpy, to feed on grievance. Instead, to have this attitude of awe and wonder and childlike wonder. I mean, you talk about learning. Margaret Barker is a very brilliant woman and has an incredibly broad background. But one of the things that you could see when she came to BYU, there was a moment when there was a slide of the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel with Adam reaching out to God. I think it was John Gee pointed out, says that the cloud in which God is residing is an anatomically correct human brain. And Margaret just turned around, looked at it, and just a big smile came on her face, and she just said, "I never thought of it." And it was this childlike joy in learning. And if we keep that, then we can avoid that cynical disillusion, which is kind of it's more of an adolescent thing. Where you find out your parents aren't everything that you thought they might be, or your adults aren't everything they might. You just instead be enlightened and just think this is all joyful.
So basically, the TLDR version is basically Vogel, Metcalf don't know what ad hoc is, and the limited geography model, other so-called apologetic plies, if you will. They're not ad hoc, they're actually just like what you would expect if you were to take the text at the grammatical, exegetical level, as any other historical translated text.
Yeah, and if you expect, one of the things is, do you expect that prophets could make mistakes? You say, well, they know they couldn't make mistakes. Well, okay, that's the theory. Where's the evidence for that theory? Have you got any?
And just on that, was also throwing, say, the intentionalist fallacy again.
Yeah.
The interpretation a translator understands of a text. Like, I know Irish, so if I were to translate, say, an Irish text, I might have some idea, like, this is what I think is the interpretation. I could be dead wrong, though. I'm just translating the words,
Right.
the phrases. It's like,
Or even,
as a non-Irish speaker, you could actually have a better exegesis of the text with recent scholarship, so.
yeah. And there's always room for us to learn more, and even from, to be like, talk about children. I think it's about children even saying things, like, take my little granddaughter for a walk up the hill outside here, and she says, "This road is heavy because it's real steep outside." Or my other granddaughter says, "Sit under me, Grandpa," instead of "sit on my lap." She "sit under me." Just, there's a fresh way of looking at things, and it's, if you have this happen often enough, it just opens up the idea to the possibility, and that in and of itself, to be open to wonder, is one of the ways to keep your testimony fresh instead of just determined, to be able to face problems, as a demonstration of pride. The first article that I wrote, I called that spiritual masochism, where the idea is to be seen facing problems as an end in itself. And I think that, that is, in many cases that I've seen, that's, people want to be seen facing problems. And what that does is that makes the problem itself the desirable thing to have. It's not just, where scientists work. You take it for granted. Yeah, this is the essential tension. We have to resolve these issues, but that's what we do. Instead, it's like, look at me. I'm here facing these problems. I have the integrity to do this, and I can even doubt in public and show that I'm, able to cope with, the existential nausea and the horror of the meaningless of life, but I'm doing it in front of everybody.
Yeah, I have an article from a few years ago on my blog, tips on being an effective LDS apologist, and you never do apologetics just for the sake of doing apologetics and things, like to win an argument and stuff like that. It's like, no, as you said, like the spiritual masochism, like simply doing it, or scholarship, just simply to answer questions, and that's it. Where, say, trying to if it be spiritually fruitful and so forth, that's very problematic.
Yeah, and we've learned by experience. Most of us, I think, we've learned by experience that anybody can say "so what" to anything we've done. And that's when Kuhn talks about values. It's a value-based decision for paradigms, and someone can value everything that I say with "so what? Who cares? I don't care." And so we've got no power other than gentleness, meekness, persuasion, true knowledge, brotherly kindness, patience. All of this, all we can do is invite. And hopefully, we set a good example, invite, offer our stuff out there, but we cannot coerce. We cannot say, force someone to believe. See, I've proven that the Book of Mormon is true, or I've proven that it's false. I've proven this. I've forced you to believe against your will. Instead, it's all about invitation and exploration, and the idea that if we explore it and we follow the people, seek out of the best books, words of wisdom, it's exciting. I think Nibley's little intellectual autobiography describes it like it's a treasure hunt. It's exciting. It's a lot of fun. That's why I do it. We don't do this for money. I mean, we're certainly not getting paid for this. But it's excitement, and we're just sharing what it is that we found that's fun to share. And it's not for fame, because we don't get any of that either. But it's just the sheer joy of finding out, boy, this is a lot cooler than I thought it was. Like reading Sorensen's book in '85, that was a revelation. It took. I grew up in the church and I had a testimony. It wasn't something that made me believe, but it's helping me to see more and appreciate what I've got. And other scholars, other things, in and outside of the church, reading Eliade's Cosmos and History, that was mind blowing. Or I've got some Joseph Campbell up there that I still appreciate. That's the pleasure in doing this stuff. It's not to put somebody down to say uncle. Although I must mention one of my favorite interactions with Vogel was on one of the boards. Someone asked him a question. He said, "Were you disappointed with the reception for New Approaches when it came out?" And they said, "No, we didn't have any illusions about the impact of a single book." And so I just typed in, the Book of Mormon was a single book. He was really upset about that. He said, no, it's not the same thing at all, because, the church has this massive publishing arm and all of these missionaries and all of this institutional push. And he says, yes, but in 1830, the missionary program was Samuel Smith and a knapsack. And it was the impact of a single book in that knapsack that went around and made some key conversions. And it's just the book itself. You think about the impact of a single book. So one of the things I like to think about is you go back to, just Joseph Smith in 1829 and just, okay, so you've said, yeah, I'm going to tell the story. I've been visited by an angel and it gave me this book and I translated it. And so you put it out and then you lose part of it. So you started off, you've got nothing going for you but failure. And then D&C 3 says, no, this is not going to happen. You can join along or not, but it's going to happen anyway. And then we can look back, almost 200 years later. This is incredible what has happened and what the book's generated and the kind of minds that have been wrestling with this book and things that, it's just to be part of that to me it's very exciting. And you think about the impact of a single book. And with what I've done, it's just I stand in awe that I'm a part of something that's so much bigger than myself. That I have the chance that I just started with my own curiosity. And every once in a while you realize, I've got something to share, something to say. And I've published now 41, 42 articles, but I've gotten from other people far more than I've put out there. I'm an unprofitable servant as far as that goes. And for all I can do, I'd be an unprofitable servant. But just the excitement of discovery and seeing what other people come up with that never in my life could I have come up with this. And I look at what the critics, like Vogel and Metcalf, and I paid attention to them and other people, and more recently some, people like Antaves. It just, or even sometimes people in the church that want to offer us, I guess, just a more cynical look at the Book of Mormon, to think of the choices that we have and which is better, the kind of predictions that we're getting, the kind of things I'm experiencing from Nibley and Paulson, and you mentioned John Tedness and what he came up with, and what he's come up with that we still haven't got. And that so many minds like that are still wrestling with this 23-year-old kid who puts his face in the hat and dictates for 8 weeks. We have, what would you predict would come out of that? What are the accurate predictions that comes out of that? And how does that relate with what we've actually got? And that, to me, it's still, every day, it's a source of awe and wonder that keeps me going on this. It's why whenever the interpreter puts out a new article, or when the review used to come out, I read every issue of the review, every article in the review for years, and just preparing for this interview, I was looking back at some of this stuff, and I'm just amazed at how good it is. And we have people say, well, it's nothing but ad hominem attacking the messenger. This is coming from people who've never read it. It's just gossip. It's just story that's told. And so being aware that's their paradigm. Well, what are their predictions? That paradigm, how, is it comprehensive, coherent, is it explained for what we have? And when you test it according to those criteria for Kuhn, it falls apart. They've got nothing. They've got nothing to offer. And what's the future promise behind that? Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Where's that?
Yeah, also in the article, you reproduced a lot of very good information from my friend Blake Oster as well as Brent Garner.
Yes.
When it comes to Garner, and by the way, I know you have the volumes in the back. Everyone should track down the 6-volume commentary, or at the very least, Traditions of the Fathers, where he discussed the difference between looking for the Book of Mormon in Mesoamerica and Mesoamerica in the Book of Mormon, and how once one realizes the importance of looking for Mesoamerica in the Book of Mormon as opposed to vice versa, that Ferguson et al. Did, that enlarges like one's appreciation of the text, as a
Yes.
translation and so forth. Like you discuss like cultural issues, geographical issues, and then when it comes to Blake Oster, and I say this as someone who disagrees with Blake when it comes to the expansion theory. Vogel is like a long list of people who just doesn't seem to understand what Oster was saying in these 1987 articles. So I appreciated the reproduction, like some emails he shared with you about like how Vogel just doesn't seem to understand what Blake was arguing in the first place.
Yeah.
So I think everyone should look at those carefully as well. So.
Yeah. Osler's 1987 article, I think, was really interesting. His discussions of translation issues, I think, are still valid. I think his examples of what he saw as necessarily as expansions, I think you can question a lot of those, but I think there's room for that kind of thing, just because it's just targumization. This is part of what translation is necessary to get the meaning across from one culture to the other. It's a word-for-word translation as a general principle doesn't work because languages are different, and cultures are different, and so there's this. I think one of Brandt's examples that I really like, he points out in the New Testament, when Jesus, we quote him as saying, "Do you light a candle and put it under a bushel? No, you set it upon a hill that giveth the light." But back in Jerusalem at that time, there were no candles, and there were no bushels. Does that mean those are translator anachronisms? But it's a good translation. It's a beautiful translation. So the idea that the translation wouldn't create any anachronisms, or shouldn't, misses what the translation is supposed to do. It's even if you look at the 1828 Webster's Dictionary, like the seventh meaning of translation in there, it's about rendering in one language, the meaning of what was in, the prior language. There's carrying across. It's moving from one place to another. There's this whole business of transmission and encoding and interpretation. So there's just room for us to have to prepare our minds. There's a statement in 3rd Nephi where Jesus is talking to them, and he says, "I can see that you're weak and you cannot understand all my words. Go home and prepare your minds to tomorrow." This idea that we have to prepare our minds to understand it, and we don't have anybody saying, "Well, Jesus, since you're here, why don't you just tell us?" So then we wouldn't have to do the work. But it just doesn't work that way. We have to put in the effort. We have to reach out. We have to treat ourselves as little children every day. That there's so much to learn, and yet so many astonishing people to learn from. We can crouch shoulder to shoulder with pygmies and complain about, how come nobody taught me this, or seek out of the best books words of wisdom. And it's easier to be enthusiastic about the questions that each of us have as individuals. So one of the reasons I like Brandt and Blake and your stuff, and Fedness and Nibley and Barker and the whole farm thing, is because I've been interested in those questions. But we all have to start wherever we are. And so I think one of the first things that lit my candle was a little thin book by Truman Madsen called Eternal Man. It's just a little short, but it's dealing with the big questions. And he says, he compares the big questions in different branches of theology and philosophy with the answers we have in the LDS faith. He says, I'm not trying to prove anything. He says, this isn't appeal to the nerve endings of the spirit. He says, it's not their objectivity because he's mentioning alternatives. It's the subjectivity because he's letting you see how it looks from different angles with this definition. And that in and of itself, for me, that was real mind expanding. And then, I started reading Nibley, and that was real exciting. And then I remember going to go see a friend of mine who had lost faith, and coming to the realization that these wouldn't help her because these weren't her questions. She had, her thing was, she said, I just want to do what I want to do without anybody telling me. So what I was offering wasn't relevant to what her main issue was. So, and that's the thing that for us has got to put us in our place humbly, is this: nobody has to take what we offer. So it's just, we offer these gifts and we try and say, yeah, I'm enthusiastic about this. We should read this by, we should read Brant Gardner's books. We should read Tara Viven's books. We should read Margaret Barker's books. But some people just aren't going to be interested. So there's that, and that has to do with the valuing.
No, that's good. Is there anything else from the article you wish to discuss?
Well, just it's there, and it was, writing it was an adventure, and it was great that I would, I'm glad that you mentioned that I got some stuff in there from Blake Ostler and Brant Gardner. All of this, it's collaborative. It's not egos wrestling with each other. We're not out there trying to fight, but we're just sharing what we love, and I think that they're gifts. And when somebody like Brant comes along, and I love that he let me quote that part, because for me it was a perfect description of a paradigm shift. You said the difference between looking for the Book of Mormon in Mesoamerica and looking for Mesoamerica in the Book of Mormon. He says everything changed with that single shift, and he lays it out how it works and how much that unfolds, and then he expands that to the 6-volume commentary and the other, the smaller books. But similar kinds of things happen with, when I read The Great Angel by Margaret Barker. It was that same kind of thing. It changed everything for me. There's one of the best comments I got on that when it came out was Alison von Felt was attending the same building at Lawrence where I was. She we're crossing passes. She was leaving her meeting and we were going to ours, and she just turned around and she said, "No wonder you called it Paradigms Regained. It changes everything." She wrote some really good essays herself that took it beyond what I could have done. And it's that sense that we're all participating in this thing, that there's always more to learn, always something transformative, always something inviting. And yet at the foundation of it, the real center of it, I believe this is real. I got a testimony from reading the Book of Mormon, and it really became mine when I read Ether. And I read the passage just before my mission. I was just reading in the Book of Ether, and he said, "And then shall you know that I have seen Jesus Christ, and he talked with me face to face in plain humility as a man speaketh to his friend." And I just had this real strong personal sense that conversation had happened. That meant Moroni was a real person. Jesus had been resurrected. And not only had Jesus been resurrected, he was the kind of God who would speak to someone in plain humility as a man speaketh to his friend. And that was the moment when it was my testimony. And I can think back to any of the challenges that I faced. I had a friend that he's totally shattered, traumatized, literally traumatized when he read Tanner's books, Changing the World of Mormonism, Shadow of Reality. And he said, "How can you know what you know and believe what you believe?" We have these different frameworks. For me, I was prepared. I'd read a bunch of other stuff before I read those books, and so I kind of, it didn't shock me. I just thought, I can see where he's coming from, but it's with that really rigid expectation. With the Tanners, and people are saying, "Well, how come nobody told me this?" Instead of, "Oh, that's interesting. I did not know that. I wonder where I can go to learn more." Do we feel entitled, or do we feel appreciative of the opportunity to learn more? Do we expect we deserve all the information on the table? And this is one of the things from Jeremy Reynolds that John Delenna's quoted. He says, "I think, the saints members of the church deserve all of the information on the table before they make a commitment, because it's so expensive and time consuming." Well, all of the information, that's omniscience, right? So they don't offer that. And we don't deserve it. We're not ready for it, but it's something that they're demanding, something that's completely unrealistic, and they're basing their lack of faith on an unrealistic expectation of what's available, and that they can't provide either. They certainly don't put everything on the table. So I think it's important in all of this just to keep our perspective and to realize if we got questions, there are amazing books out there, amazing scholars that have bringing things to the table that in my lifetime I couldn't have done. And when I read these and somebody shares that with me, and you get something like I got back there in God's Image and Likeness, like Bradshaw's humongous book, to realize, yeah, there's a lot to learn. And do we shy away from that, or do we say, swallow and think, maybe this will be fun? This will be a lot of fun. And it has been. And to see connections between things, like one of the first articles I did was Nigh Unto Death, where I compared Alma's conversion in the Book of Mormon to contemporary near-death research. And that was just kind of trippy too. When I was doing it, I wondered why it hadn't been done before. And so it's something where we just start to see something more in the text that we think that we've read, we think we're familiar with. The stuff that Matt Bowen is doing with language, the stuff,
that's absolutely phenomenal.
Yeah, where he's looking into the implications of wordplay and punning and things, and behind the translation they got, and it's assuming that there's a translation there. But again, if you think in terms of Kuhn, okay, it's testable. Let's make the test. Accuracy of key predictions. Yeah, this stuff starts to fit together, and there's all sorts of complications, and he just keeps on coming up with it. Everywhere he looks, he's finding it. He's got the set of tools that allows him to see these things, and the imagination to go to work on it. Is it comprehensive and coherent? Well, that's just a linguistic approach. But for a believer, well, yeah, I expect all of this stuff and all of the New World stuff and all of like the LIDAR surveys that just happened just a few years ago. When when an LDS person watches that, we're just eyes bugging out of our heads and thinking, yeah, this is great. But what should we expect if Joseph Smith made it all up? What we should expect when the LIDAR pulls back the curtain on what's really under the jungles down there, what we should expect is to see Joseph Smith exposed and humiliated. That he should be wrong about everything, instead of a revolution in Mesoamerican archaeology that happens just in a moment. You just see it. They just turn on this thing and the simulation, and you peel away the jungle, and there's the world that we read about in Helaman and through Nephi. And that's exciting, to be a part of. And the fruitfulness of it, and just the delight in it. And then there's, part of it's just, you go to church and you watch people serving each other. That's part of it too. If this is just the offshoot of a con game, why is there so much love? Why is there so much joy? Why do hearts get changed this way? And so is there grounds for faith? Yeah. We don't have the perfect knowledge yet, but of course nobody does. The critics, least of all, as certain as they like to say they are, especially Vogel and Metcalf. I noticed that over years, but I just think all of the stuff that if I'd have dropped out 30, 40 years ago, all the stuff that I would have missed, and I would have had no idea what I was missing. And in the eternities. Oh, sorry. It's just exciting to be part of, and just to see these people sharing this kind of knowledge and to have it available so easily now. Whereas you don't have to go to the bound periodicals, and you don't have to prowl used bookstores, and you don't have to use bookfinder.com and track things down. Like when I was starting to work on Paradigms Regained, I went to the KU library in Lawrence, Kansas, where I was living, and I found a copy in that library of her first book, the Older Testament. And I thought that it was wonderfully convenient that a book that otherwise I couldn't get, I'd used Bookfinder, I'd used Amazon, it was just gone. It's not only out of print, you just couldn't get it. And there it was in this, my little hometown, just exactly what I needed at the right time. And part of the thing that we learned too in going through this is the way that God touches our lives. And to see what comes out of just these moments, just the right thing in the right place, that we just talked about, when Nephi is talking about the Laihona, about how God is able to do much with small things. There's a passage in the Doctrine and Covenants early on where the Lord says, let no one count these are small things, for there is much in futurity that depends on them. So, now I'm 68 years old, and I can look back at these little moments where there could have been a choice one way or the other, or a meeting with a person, or discovering a book, or having an impulse, to write, to read, to learn of something, to see what comes out of that, to see it in the long term. That in and of itself, too, that for me, that's incredibly faith promoting, mind expanding, and humbling, because, gee, what if I'd missed all this?
Yeah, thanks for sharing that.
There's Beatrice Roberts.
Yeah, unfortunately my video is gone, but be that as mate, that's actually, thanks for sharing that. That's kind of important, like, say, putting things on the shelf and having the humility, but also, like, it's learning experience, and, like, there's so much out there, and there will be so much in the future as well. You kind of mentioned the Mesoamerican stuff. That's understudied, but I think Jerry Grover and others have done a good job. And really looking forward to, like, say, future things, like, say, the next decade or two, onwards. So we've kind of actually come. I think we're more or less at the end of the episode. So, like, again, Kevin, I really do appreciate you coming on today, and all the great stuff you've done with Barker and other topics as well, including this article. As I said, I'll include it in the show notes. So hopefully we can actually have you on in the future as well. Maybe if you want to, like, discuss Barker or other topics as well. But again, really do appreciate it. And thanks again.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I wish you well in your adventures in Utah.
Thanks.
I'm glad to see you've got that kind of position, because it's, you've got an amazing set of skills, and it's nice to see you in a place where you can use them doing something you love.
Thanks, I appreciate that. And hopefully we'll have more future episodes in the new year. I'll be spending Christmas with Stephen Smoot and his family in Idaho. So there won't be any new episodes until then, but hopefully we'll have more episodes and a better camera in the new year. So if any listeners want to go into the GoFundMe or Patreon or whatever for a proper camera, then this one I managed to ship over from Ireland, go ahead. But until then, thanks again, Kevin, for coming on, and hopefully everyone will appreciate this episode and enjoy it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert.